Loveridge with the North Central Regional Center for Rural Development and the Community Assessment Education to Promote Behavioral Health Planning and Evaluation Project. And I'm your moderator today. I'll be checking the chat box for questions that the participants might have as our presentation rolls out. And with that, I'm just going to turn it over to Jessica Tess, who's our social media specialist on the project, and she's going to share some of her thinking with you. Go ahead, Jessica.
Thanks a bunch, Dr. Leverage. So hi, my name is Jessica, and I'm going to be giving this presentation today called Social Media Strategy to Create Change, Community Behavioral Health. And so what I'm going to be talking about is trying to create change in the certain context of social media. So if you are thinking about adding a social media campaign to your toolkit as you deal with certain community behavioral health issues in your area, this would be hopefully very helpful to you, just a good crash course in how to think through starting something like that. So like Dr. Leverage said, as you have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat box. I see a question right now. D. Owens would like to know how we're going to get the slides, and after this presentation we're going to make them available on the website, which is healthbench.info. Also, a quick icebreaker. I see a few people already have, but if you haven't already, we've set up a little poll there in the corner you should see on your screen. And as you get a minute, please fill out that poll. We'd like to know, what social media platforms do you already use? So please check all that apply, and at the end we'll kind of reveal where everyone is in their social media usage. One last request is, as you're thinking about it, in a couple of weeks we're going to have another webinar around social media, just a What's Trending webinar about behavioral health in social media. So if there are topics you are interested in hearing about what's trending, please also write those in the chat box for us. So with that, let's get started. A brief thank you to all of our supporters, which are listed here. They should all be listed here on my screen. I don't see the USDA logo. So hopefully you see that. If not, they are also one of our supporters. So I'd like to start off with a question: what is social media strategy? And so whether you're very familiar with different platforms of social media or you're very new, most people, when they think about social media, they'll think of a specific platform. They'll think of Facebook or Twitter or something like that. And so it's important to remember that with social media, trends come and go very quickly. Some stick around and flourish for longer than others, but it's kind of relative that way. And so when you want to put together a social media strategy of any kind, you don't want to start with specific tools. You want to start with goals and then pick your appropriate tools. And so putting together a social media strategy should consist of two different types of goals: macro goals and micro goals. So briefly, you can think of a macro goal as a long-term goal that identifies a problem, a gap you intend to close, and your macro goals should really define the message or brand behind your project. Meanwhile, micro goals, you can think of these as tactics, short-term goals that are small, actionable, measurable, and they are small ways of breaking up your larger goals into steps that will accomplish those bigger things. So just keeping those things in mind. So for instance, with the CAPE project, which if you're not familiar with, you can read about at healthbench.info, one of our macro goals is to benchmark community health. And so some of our micro goals might be to have people follow us on Twitter who also care about the same things, to join a specific social media campaign we might start, that sort of thing. So just keep those concepts in mind as we keep going. So I am going to be using a very useful resource today that I found when it comes to social media strategy, especially with campaigns in order to create change. I'm going to be pulling from a book called The Dragonfly Effect: Quick and Effective and Powerful Ways to Use Social Media to Drive Social Change. You can see the authors listed there. And they have a specific formula called Focus Get And they have this metaphor of a dragonfly, which has 4 wings, 4 tools that all need to work for you at the same time. And as you can see from that image, they break these 4 things down into focus, or having a specific goal, engaging with a specific audience by making a personal connection, grabbing attention from that audience in order to engage with them, and then having that audience take action, enabling and empowering others to take action. So throughout this presentation, what I plan to do is I'm going to more fully introduce each of these wings. I'm going to give a behavioral health related example of a successful social media campaign that sort of represents best practices for one of these wings. Some of these examples I've grabbed specifically from the Dragonfly Effect, and others I've just found on my own that I thought were relevant. And then I'm going to just kind of point out or highlight some of those best practices or core principles. There's also going to be a little bit of an interactive part of this presentation where I'm going to pause after talking about one of these wings, and we're going to do some thinking about putting these into action around a specific example. So hopefully you'll be ready to give your feedback in the chat box, and I'll let you know when that is coming up as we go. So firstly, as you saw from that image, the first wing of the Dragonfly for social media campaign is a focus. So focus is about concentrating on a single outcome and not thinking too big with your goals. And I'd like to give a specific story that really represents a campaign that has good focus. So real quick, I'm going to read you this example and then talk about it a little bit. So by age 31, Samir was a newly married Silicon Valley entrepreneur running a hot mobile gaming company. He had everything going for him. Then, on a routine business trip to Mumbai, he started to feel sick. He lost his appetite and had trouble breathing. Samir chalked it up to the 100-degree weather and unbearable humidity, but a doctor's visit found that his white blood cell count was wildly out of whack. Samir was diagnosed with leukemia, a cancer that starts in the blood-forming tissue such as the bone marrow, and this diagnosis seemed unreal. His friends, a tight-knit group of young and driven entrepreneurs and professionals, decided they would attack his sickness as they would any business challenge. If the doctors said that the odds to find a match were 1 in 20,000, all they had to do was to get 20,000 South Asian individuals into the bone marrow registry. The only problem was that they had just weeks to get this done. With focus, efficiency, and hyperutilization of social media, Team Samir used Web 2.0 services like Facebook, Google Docs, and YouTube to mobilize and empower others to organize bone marrow drives all over the country. In 11 weeks, Samir's supporters registered 24,611 South Asians into the bone marrow registry and found a match for Samir. And the 7,500 people they registered in the San Francisco Bay Area, where Samir lived, yielded 80 matches for other leukemia patients, an unattended but celebrated consequence. So this quick anecdote really has some great pieces to it that represent having superior focus for a social media campaign. And I'm going to break this down to you in this little acronym called HATCH. And HATCH represents these couple of different principles below, which is that to have a superior focus, your goals should be humanistic. They should focus on understanding your audience rather than making assumptions and quick solutions. They should be actionable. They should have short-term tactical micro goals to achieve your long-term goals, and we've talked about this a little bit already. They should be testable. Before you launch your campaign, you should identify metrics that will help evaluate your progress and inform your actions. You should have clarity, which means you should keep your goal clear to increase your odds of success and to keep your momentum. And finally, your focus should really be serving happiness. So you should ensure that your goals are meaning to you and your audience. So with the story of Samir, we can check these things off rather easily. Samir's campaign was focused on him as an individual, a person that people could relate to. It was actionable, so they had process goals of getting others to host their own donor drives. It was testable. They could tell by the end of the couple of weeks period whether they were able to get 20,000 people into their donor registry, and of course they were able to. This campaign had clarity, so they had this very specific goal, 20,000 South Asians into the bone marrow registry. They didn't confuse that goal with other things such as aims to cure cancer generally or create registries in other areas. And for happiness, of course, this campaign was related to doing something that was meaningful to this group and feeling good, helping their friend Samir. So given that little anecdote and some of those key principles, this is the first time I'm going to ask that people get a little interactive with this presentation. So let's take a behavioral health issue that is going on right now in the United States. I thought we might use the example of trying to tackle meth use. Depending on what state you're from, some states are really struggling with this issue right now the past couple of years, others not so much, but it's likely you've heard about it. So I'd like to hear in the chat box, if you don't mind, writing some of your ideas. How would we focus a single goal related to tackling meth use? And I'd like to give you a minute, and I'll look at the chat box and see what people have to write. Oh, we have typing. Just waiting for a couple people here to finish typing. All right, from Frank M2 we have, at the community level, decrease the amount of emergency room visits that are related to meth use. Yes, that would be a great example of a small, actionable goal to go for. Not too big, not too abstract. Provide treatment information. Oops, it just passed me. Provide treatment information to all law enforcement agencies in our service area. A focus on the children who are affected in the home in which meth is manufactured will answer the need for humanism. Yeah, great. Those were all great examples. Wonderful. That's the idea. Okay, I didn't want to spend too much time on this before we get to the next wing. So those were great. We'll put this little hypothetical situation down and move on to something else. Let's see. Cheryl St. Clair says, determine the health needs in a specific community. Yep, that's really good. We might want to get a little more specific with that in terms of how. Keep them coming, but in the meantime, I'm going to move on to Wing 2, which is about grabbing attention. So grabbing attention is getting noticed by your target audience. You've picked a goal, whether it's one of these great things we've picked here, dental care for recovering addicts. We'll refer back to this in a minute. And so now you need participants. You need momentum for your campaign, and so you need to get people involved. And so when it comes to grabbing attention, I'm going to give another short example and then talk about some principles. Also, I apologize for the slide having the D from unexpected on a different line. Sorry about that. So the example I'd like to give that is an example of best practices for grabbing attention for an audience is a campaign called Table for Two. So Table for Two is a Japan-based nonprofit that addresses famine in developing countries and simultaneously tackles obesity in developed countries. So pause real quick. So even though this campaign is something from Japan, I thought it was pretty good because we also deal with a similar issue in the United States. We simultaneously have problems with obesity as well as hunger. There are plenty of families in the United States who don't get enough to eat. So anyway, this organization, Table for Two, sells healthy meals in corporate and school cafeterias and cafes, and for each sale it donates 20 cents, the cost of a school meal, to buy a lunch for a child in Africa. Instead of pleading with people to give money to feed the hungry, Table for Two came up with a creative name and supported it with a compelling visual image. The logo is an image of two lunch tables, one full and one empty, abutted so as to form the shape of a T. This visual image serves to grab attention and differentiates Table for Two from other nonprofits with similar goals. And as you can see, I've grabbed the image from their website. You can see what I just described there, their Table for Two logo. So, a few things we can grab out of there as good core principles for trying to grab attention with an audience, I have listed here. You should grab attention by being personal, create a personal hook in someone's mind, grab attention by doing something unexpected. People like consuming and then sharing new information. Grab attention by being visual, try to show instead of just telling. Photos and videos speak millions of words and they synthesize your thoughts quickly. And visceral, try to design your campaign so that it triggers the senses, sound, sight, hearing, or taste. So really, I mean, if you think back to the last time something grabbed your attention, whether that was on social media or just walking down the street, I think as you think back on that memory, you could probably pick out one or a couple of these principles for why that moment was able to grab your attention. So, you can go off of personal experience here. So, okay, let's go back. Let's pick up our little hypothetical, maybe not so hypothetical, situation right now of we are trying to tackle meth use. So we have a specific goal. I'm going to go back here and pick. Okay, let's pick this because a couple of great specific focus goals were given, but I'm going to pick one of them for the sake of the example. Let's say our goal is at the community level decrease the amount of emergency room visits that are related to meth use. So if that is our goal, what are some ways we could grab attention from our target audience or a target audience? Once again, feel free to utilize the chat box now and I'll give everyone a moment to think. If that's our goal, how could we grab attention? Okay, we've got one comment in here so far. Talk about the consequences of overuse of the emergency room. Okay. So trying to create awareness, we could say that type of grabbing attention. Maybe how unexpected the emergency room gets used by the number of meth-using patients. Let's see, Sarah Valentine says, mock visual of community members showing the percent affected. And of course those numbers might be shocking to a community. And Liz Stafford says, if a dollar amount can be attached, use that. Large amounts of money spent grabs attention. Definitely. Hannah says, find a compelling story of a community member that came to the ER for meth use. De-identified, of course. And then BK says, show the effects on the whole family, that it isn't just the meth user that needs the support. Yes, great. All of those are wonderful examples of ways we could grab attention, and depending on who our specific audience is, one of those might be more appropriate in one situation or another. Linda says, place addresses of alternative treatment clinics where users live. How to help your friend who is a meth user, Esther. Okay, and that last one jumps a little bit ahead, but we'll be getting to talking about those types of steps very soon. So for now, great suggestions. Let's move on. Okay, we've made a goal. So in our case, we're trying to limit emergency room visits of meth users. We have talked about ways to grab the attention of our audience. Now we need to engage them. So engaging your audience is really about getting them to remain emotionally involved. So trying to keep their attention once we have it. So in this case, instead of starting with an example, I'm going to just name some principles and then kind of show how an example utilizes those principles. I just thought that might work a little better in this situation. So some principles of keeping an audience engaged are telling stories. As human beings, we always enjoy stories, so find compelling, sticky stories to convey critical information, and a couple of the suggestions in here were examples of just that as well. Empathize. So as you engage, let your audience engage you. What is important to them, and how does that relate to your campaign? Be authentic. The more authentic you come across, the easier it will be for others to connect with you and your cause. And believe it or not, you might think that social media might be a place where you're not sure how authenticity can come across, considering like a tweet is only 140 characters or whatever, but believe it or not, it does come through in certain ways, so it's good to be aware of it. The last principle I'm going to name right now would be to make sure we match our media. So remember I said in the beginning, don't start with tools, start with goals. So now might be the time, once we've thought your way through your campaign at this point, to start thinking about what media platforms you want to use. How and where we say something can be as important as what we say. So think back to some of the examples. Oh, I have a quick question here. Would you please say empathize and be authentic over? You faded in and out. Oh, I'm very sorry about that. Real quick. Empathize. As you engage, let your audience engage you. What is important to them? How does that relate to your campaign? And be authentic. The more authentic you come across, the easier it will be for others to connect with you and your cause. Empathize your shared values and beliefs. And then I was simply pointing out that authenticity is something that is detectable over social media, even if, say, you're only tweeting 140 characters. Okay, hopefully people were able to hear me. If I somehow fade out again, please let me know. So I do have an example of a social media campaign that is going on currently that I think is doing a pretty good job of engaging with its target audience. So this campaign, I've got the picture here, is called Target Zero to Thrive. And this campaign is trying to tackle mental health. And so one sample tweet that they put over Twitter in this last week in regard to mental health was, and I quote, "When we treat cancer, we are not satisfied with anything less than full remission. Why should mental health treatment be any different? Join the Target Zero to Thrive social media campaign this April to support a wellness goal of 0 symptoms." So with this specific thing I just read, they're telling a specific story as well as empathizing. And so the story they are telling is that having a mental illness is the same thing as having cancer, in terms of that you want to treat it in the similar manner with a similar attitude of trying to get someone 100% well. And this is a pretty good idea considering most families, most individuals know someone in their family or their friends who has dealt with cancer, who has possibly beat it or unfortunately passed away because of it. And so they can be pretty sure by comparing mental health or mental illness to having cancer that they're going to strike a deep personal chord in their audience. So in that way, it's making a pretty smart metaphor there to keep their audience engaged with their campaign. At least I thought so. And you can find this on Twitter right now if you want to search for it, and you can see other types of messages that they're sending out. So before we return back to our little hypothetical campaign with math, there are just a couple other of characteristics of highly engaging campaigns that I wanted to point out. So highly engaging campaigns have transparency. meaning they share news as it happens, even if it might not appear to be in their best interest. And with social media, information at your fingertips is the expectation, and so if you're not engaging in that way, you're not going to come across as very authentic, which we also talked about as being important. Highly engaging campaigns are interactive. Again, another word that should come to mind when we think of social media. Information flows between the community and a campaign, and actions that are initiated by both the campaigners and their audience should happen with ease. Highly engaging campaigns should have immediacy, so they should release information to the community as it becomes available, and of course we've already said that that also has to deal with being transparent. A highly engaging campaign facilitates, so as a cause or a company acts as a caretaker to their message development, that is done in a way that doesn't really control it so much as just facilitates it, because you're inviting people to participate with you together to build your campaign, because you can't do it without your audience by yourself. And so that's why you're reaching out. And so a highly engaging campaign also has commitment. So you can count on the fact that if your audience is participating, it's something meaningful to them. And so you should, even if you run into obstacles or problems, remain committed, because your audience is really committing their time and possibly their money to you. Highly engaging campaigns, finally, are co-created. I talked about this a little bit already, that the ideas and the implementation of your ideas are as likely to come from your community or your audience as well as from yourself, the originator of the campaign. Okay, so a lot of things thrown out there. Let's go back to the situation of dealing with meth use as an example. So just a quick reminder, our goal is to limit the number of emergency room visits from meth users. We've pointed out a few different ways to grab attention from a target audience. So what are some ways we can engage with that audience? What are ways we can keep their attention? And once again, I'll give people a minute. Try to put a few suggestions into the chat box for all of us to look at. Granted, this one's a little tricky, trying to differentiate grabbing attention versus keeping attention. I realize that. So if it's related to something you've already put into the chat box, that's fine. So we have from Cheryl St. Clair 2, tell about alternative sources of care for meth users. So giving resources. From Dr. Leverage, bring the issue to the attention of local media. Ooh, plenty of contributions. Let's see. Co-create. Have a community forum about meth use issues, how it has affected families in the community. Great, having people tell their own stories. From Frank M2, sending out a daily tweet with a different unfavorable health outcome or statistic related to meth. BK, show the effects on different members of the community, even those that don't use and maybe feel like this problem doesn't affect them. So that's even about increasing the reach of your audience. I'll wait a few more seconds for whoever's left to finish typing. Keep the number of ER visits up to date, even if the number is increasing instead of decreasing, as is the goal. Definitely, that's a good one. From Christina McFarland, very important to address the stigma of behavioral health issues and relating these issues to more socially acceptable health conditions. Decreasing stigma increases access to services. Yes, and we saw an example such as that with the Target Zero to Thrive. Great. And as I just said, it can sometimes be difficult to pick apart how you're grabbing attention versus how you're keeping attention, and likely they are related to one another. Okay, let's talk about the last wing of our dragonfly, which is to take action. So we've got a goal, we've grabbed attention, we have kept attention, so we're doing great in just the 30 minutes we've had this presentation, hypothetically. So given you've been successful at all those things, now you want your audience to take action on your campaign. And so taking action is about requiring individuals to exert themselves and make the transition between caring to actually doing something about it. And the magical formula in order to get people to take action is to ask. So I've got an example here, real quick, of one current social media campaign that is asking to take action. So what it says here is, I will keep in touch and ask a friend or loved one how they are. Nearly 60,000 people have pledged to tackle mental health stigma. Will you take action? And so right there at the end of that little example, this campaign is asking, will you take action? Very straightforwardly. And that is a very direct way of asking. However, there are different ways you can ask an audience to take action, and so I just want to give some examples of different ways you can ask, and I'm sure as I read through these you'll think of different examples you've come across that fit into these categories. So, in contrast to the example that I have on the slide, which is asking very directly, a lot of social media campaigns or campaigns in general will ask in an indirect or an implied manner. And so this would be the difference between stating, children are starving in Africa, versus, will you give money to buy food for African children? So you might find by putting less pressure in the way you ask that more people will be willing to participate. And really what you're doing here is you're avoiding the awkwardness of having someone feel embarrassed to say no. By asking in an implied way, they may be more likely to return to your campaign later once they feel that they can participate, versus them feeling awkward about having to actually say no and not wanting to come back. Sorry, I was just watching the chat box for a moment. A second example or way to ask people to take action in a social media campaign would be what you could call a reciprocity ask. And so this involves offering something in return for a donation or taking action. One example is when the Disabled American Veterans Organization mails out requests with sets of free personalized address labels. Their success rate doubles from 18 to 35%. I just donated to a radio station the other day, and if I donated a certain amount, they were willing to send me a tote bag or some sort of, other type of piece of, with their brand name on it, something like that. You're going to get something for giving something. Another category of asking is a concession ask. And this is kind of interesting to me, and I'm sure it's happened to me before, but a concession ask is when you request a major commitment first, and then after you're rejected, you ask for something less difficult. And I like this example that when random passersby were asked to help chaperone juvenile detention center inmates on a day trip to the zoo, 17% said yes. However, when researchers first asked if they would volunteer 2 hours a week as an unpaid counselor for the center, which everyone rejected, and then asked if they would chaperone a zoo visit, they got a 50% acceptance rate. And so really this is probably the situation where you ask for something, people have to say no, and so to feel better about saying no, they're willing to do something less difficult for you. So that's just one strategy that has been used before successfully. There's the social validation ask, which is when you show potential donors or participants that their peers are contributing to your cause. And the example I gave here actually is an example of that. So they say 60,000 people have pledged to tackle mental health stigma. Will you take action? As in, 60,000 of your peers are doing this and you should too. There's the competitive ask, which leverages competitive urges by emphasizing how a participant can stack up in a cause against others. And then lastly, which we talked about in the beginning, there's just a direct authoritative ask, which is where you ask very directly. However, you still can be strategic about making a direct request in that you can often include quoting scientific studies or getting an expert to endorse your cause, enlisting a celebrity spokesman. If you're going to ask directly, it's a good idea to try and give yourself ways to be credible in order to do that. Okay, so you have to ask in order to get someone to take action, but there are many ways to do it. So depending on who your audience is, you might decide that one way is better or another, or depending on if you have multiple audiences, that might affect it too. So there was one more example here, which I'll go over briefly because I don't want to take up too much time, but Zamzi is a product, an activity monitor, that was part of a campaign to address obesity in children. And that campaign included two different types of audiences, and so they really needed to ask two different ways of taking action. And so, of course, the product was meant to be worn by children to monitor their activity, and so they had to ask kids to want to use their product, which they did by getting kids engaged in forums online where they could compare with their friends how much activity they had been engaging in and stuff like that, versus their parents who had to buy the device for them, which was a $50 device. I mean, think of this like a high-tech pedometer that can do a couple fancier things. It's, not going to cost you just $5. And so for the parents, they had to ask parents to take action on something that would address avoiding obesity in their kids. And so you might have to ask two different audiences in two different ways to do two different things or more. So you might differentiate. So to close off, sort of talking about taking action, I just want to mention a few brief things about making behavior change easy. And so in order to make behavior change easy, you want to ask small, concrete things. So people won't know what to do if you're too abstract. So if you want to ask people to save the planet, that's never going to be as effective as asking someone to use energy-saving light bulbs and even provide some for free. Secondly, and this is especially important and relevant to social media campaigns, which is you want to offer a kit that can contain templates. You don't want to expect your participants to contribute and reinvent things that you already know to work, and so you want to provide those resources for them. And lastly, you want to really encourage the reuse of good material. So hopefully with social media especially, you can have constant communication between your participants and stay aware of what's working out in the field. So spread success stories, encourage people to adapt tools and techniques, and achieve similar success. And let's see, the example from the last slide, that Target Zero to Thrive, if you visit their website, they do include templates for talking with different types of stakeholders or audiences you might want to get involved. Okay, so let's wrap up our little situation that we've been brainstorming the last 40 minutes. We focused on trying to reduce emergency room visits by meth users. We talked about grabbing attention and keeping attention by circulating stories and impressive numbers in the community about what meth use, the effects of it. So now that we have done all that, I want to ask you to put into the chat box just a few examples of what you think would be good ways to ask someone to take action on tackling meth use in their community. And we're going to do this quickly because I know we're close to time. Well, I saw some people typing.
So Frank M2 had a suggestion.
Oh, he did. You're right. Have an emergency room nurse who deals with meth, ODs daily, ask for community members to support the campaign. Sure. But we might want to say how they can support the campaign in a specific way. Okay, well, since this one seems a little difficult for people, I will give you some satisfaction in pointing you to a successful social media campaign dealing with meth right now, which is the methproject.org. You can go and visit their website. They have a lot of great resources. They're a large-scale prevention program aimed at reducing meth. They do it through public service messaging, public policy, and community outreach. They use a lot of shocking pictures and information about the consequences of meth use, and I did not put any of those here because I didn't want to surprise anybody. But go ahead, take a look at that, and think through these steps and how they do it if you're curious. But in the meantime, I want to now open up for general questions. And if you're familiar with CAPE, which seeks to benchmark community health topics in 10 pilot communities, and you have different ideas for grabbing attention, engaging, or asking people to take action, feel free to put them out there. And lastly, we'd also like to hear, what are you already doing now in terms of a social media campaign, if you're doing anything?
And we'll share back the results of the poll here too, because I don't think we did that. So looks like Facebook is the big winner in this group. So
Of course.
are people using Facebook to work on community health issues?
And if you're not aware of it already, please visit the CAPE Facebook page, which you can find through the website. Any general... Sorry, go ahead, Dr. Leverage.
Yeah, well, people are thinking of their questions. A couple of people are typing. What would be the, for the newbie, what would be the first thing that you would do if you were, say, wanting to work on meth in your community? How would you do that? Day one, you're a newbie. Day one, you're trying to work on meth. What would you do?
Is this question for me or for them?
For you.
For me, okay. Yeah. Well, I would be getting together with people, who care about the project and really trying to brainstorm, what are your goals? What are your long-term goals, and what are some smaller goals that you can make to try and get there, even before you kind of touch the social media?
Okay. And Barbara O'Neill had put in a resource for folks, so that's great. Thanks, Barbara.
And it's interesting, as I look at the results for the poll, I pretty much put these social media platforms in the order of their popularity nationally. And so it looks like it matches up pretty well with this group.
Except for Twitter.
Yeah,
Twitter's a little
except
bit,
for Twitter.
yeah, a little out of sync there, but the rest of them, yeah. I guess it's a more professional group, so we got more LinkedIn people than Twitter people, or something.
Well, Twitter can be kind of difficult in that whatever you want to say, you got to say it in 140 characters, and so you've really got to be concise, and that can have a learning curve, especially if you have a goal versus you're just on Twitter. Another thing you could do, let's say, even if it's not meth, if you have a community behavioral health issue that you want to start tackling and you want to include a social media campaign, day one, something you can do is just start linking up with other people who care about the same things. Let's say you don't have anyone in your office that necessarily is on board with you, but you still want to create a movement purely online. Get on Twitter or Facebook, whatever you're comfortable with, and start finding groups out there that care about the same things you do. So let's see. Frank says, are there any suggestions for measuring or evaluating the amount of behavior change that results from your particular campaign? Well, it really depends on what you're asking people to do. So let's say, for example, you want people to spread awareness. So, like mental health stigma, you want people to spread awareness about this problem. You could make a goal of saying, I want my tweets about mental health stigma. I want to have 100 retweets. And so you can go and track, how many people are retweeting your messages about mental health stigma. That's something you can measure and evaluate.
Or going back to the hospital visits, the emergency room visits, you actually visits, right? Um,
Mm-hmm.
it could be an outcome variable that behavior change from that outcome variable.
Right. And so that will depend on, is your social media campaign aimed at certain outcomes that you can see on social media versus see out in the real world?
Sarah Valentine had a question about how do you integrate rhetoric and social media campaigns?
Sure. So this really comes down to knowing your audience, and also, if you're unsure, just sort of trying things. So you may try one way if you know a specific audience and what will probably connect with them, and trying to translate that into social media. And if you don't get good results out of that, try something else and go for it again. There's nothing wrong with trying, failing, and trying something else. And another good thing to do in terms of the rhetoric you should use for a social media campaign is, get into a social media platform and look at what is already out there that's successful. So, what social media campaigns seem to be doing really well? Getting lots of retweets, getting lots of spread, lots of people are excited about it, participating. What are they doing that seems to be working for them? And try to emulate it or adapt it for your own cause.
Barbara wanted to know about what are the most effective ask methods when you're looking for.
Sure, yeah. And I really think this one depends on your audience, and I hate to say that, it depends thing, but it's really true. Going to go back to my page here about the different types of asking. Even culturally, people hopefully I'm not going to be too general here, but people in Western cultures tend to respond really well to direct asking. So, attend the webinar today. Someone who really asks you very directly, that might get you to actually show up to the webinar versus, we have a webinar today. It really depends on your audience, who you're trying to connect to. And really, in that case, what you might do is you might look for campaigns that are similar to yours, and you might contact those people or observe what they're doing and try to analyze the way they are asking to get those ideas.
Well, excellent. I think we had a great set of resources here today. It looks like the typing has quieted down a bit, so I want to thank you for joining us today and remind everybody that the webinar is recorded and it will be posted on the website that's listed there in the notes box. So report there and share it with your colleagues.
And thank you, everyone.